Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for October 23rd, 2023. I'm going to take up the situation in the Middle East and also Ukraine from a specific standpoint, which is the decision of the people running U.S. policy, the neocons, the war hawks, the corporate cartels, that they will continue these wars because they see that as the only way to sustain the power of the unipolar order. As the murderous Madeleine Albright said, the U.S. is the indispensable nation, meaning that the U.S. should be the nation which determines policy for all nations. And this is clearly the view of the people behind the Biden administration. Blinken in particular is a protege of Albright. But this is a long-standing tradition inside the permanent bureaucracy in the State Department, sections of the intelligence community, sections of the military, that the U.S. must weaken and defeat, hopefully without having to go to military, the Russians and the Chinese and force them to subordinate themselves to the globalist unipolar order. Now, there are reports on CNN and the Wall Street Journal that there have been requests from Biden that Israel postpone the ground invasion into Gaza in order to allow the freeing of the hostages, that there could be a short-term ceasefire providing some water and fuel to Gaza in return for hostage release. There were 2 hostages released at the end of last week, largely due to mediation by Qatar. But Netanyahu refused to accept it. And the White House is continuing to say, well, Biden personally said that we will continue to stand by Israel. And when the report from CNN came out that the U.S. is seeking to postpone the ground invasion, the White House walked back on that and said, quote, Biden has no input into Israel's plans. So how is this the indispensable nation? Why can't the U.S. say, stop the fighting, stop the killing? Now, an insight into that comes from Biden's speech Thursday night. I just want to read you these quotes. You may be familiar with them, but they indicate that the extent to which the U.S. policy is shaped by this line that of the Summit of Democracies, that it's the democracies against dictators, terrorists, totalitarians, and the democracies must fight for the free world. Here's what Biden said. He said, Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy. American leadership is what holds the world together. American values are what makes us a partner that other nations want to work with. To put all that at risk if we walk away from Ukraine, if we turn our backs on Israel, it's just not worth it. And then the next paragraph is extraordinary in its irony and hypocrisy. Biden said, history has taught us that when terrorists don't pay a price for their terror, when dictators don't pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos and death and more destruction. And the cost and threats to America and the world keep rising. Well, he's talking about accountability, right? Who holds the United States accountable? Who holds NATO accountable? The destruction of Libya, the destruction of Afghanistan, the destruction of Iraq, all on the basis of phony narratives. Who is holding George W. Bush and Tony Blair and Cameron and Sarkozy and others accountable? There's no accountability for the unipolar order because, as Biden and Blinken say, the U.S. is the main defender of the rules-based order. And the rules are those of Washington, London, and Brussels, not international law. And so, as you can see, Biden has no intention of moving away from this idea of the unipolar order. And just to give you an additional sense of this, this is the policy outlined by the Atlantic Council in its so-called Summit for Democracies. And this has nothing to do with democracy. It has to do with an imposition from the top down of policies that benefit a global central banker operation, whether it's the World Economic Forum, the City of London, whatever you want to call it. It's not about the rights of sovereign nation states to develop in peace, but about maintaining a certain order that keeps a flow of loot going into the corporate cartels. And the CEO of the Atlantic Council, Frederick Kemp, reflects this in his comments on Biden's speech. Keep in mind, the Atlantic Council is funded by the British government, by sections of U.S. and British intelligence, and by the corporate cartels. He said Biden's speech may come to be known as the inflection point address, and it was as eloquent and compelling as any he has ever delivered in his lifetime. Well, that's a pretty low bar. He goes on to say that it has the potential to be the most significant of his presidency, that he looked sharp and spoke with the vigor of a man who understands the historic moment and his role in it. He connected the dots between Russia's criminal war in Ukraine and Hamas's terrorist attack on Israel, assisted by Iran. This is the line that's coming out now, that Iran is part of the new axis of evil, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and so on, and that the U.S. must stand firm against it. Deputy Defense Secretary Austin has now put the Aircraft Carrier Strike Group, the USS Dwight Eisenhower, under the U.S. Central Command. You have 2 aircraft carrier strike groups, plus Austin announced additional manpower being made available for rapid deployment. And then he went on to warn of a crisis moving towards significant escalation. Well, of course, if you send carrier groups, 10,000 troops with 2,000 more on readiness, of course it's an escalation. Then you look at the new package that Biden was defending that was put before the Congress. And remember, this comes after 2 things. After the Congress rejected in the supplemental budget deal, a $24 billion increase to Ukraine. And at the same time, a New York Times report that said the U.S. is about to run out of money from the initial $113 billion allocation. So the new package includes $61.4 billion more for Ukraine, of which $12 billion is going to pay the expenses of the Ukrainian government and its employees. Did you know you, the American taxpayer, are paying for the Ukrainian government? And then $10.6 billion for Israel on top of the $3.8 billion that's part of a 10-year guarantee. Now, that's not enough for some. Nikki Haley, who's being pushed by some of the neocons as a replacement for Trump, if his legal problems move him out of a position as a candidate, Haley said, we need to have a Department of Offense, not Department of Defense. She called for a significant increase in the defense budget. Now, not surprisingly, she and her husband have made $12 million since the end of 2021, after she left employment with the Trump administration. $12 million. She has a $300,000 a year consulting position on the board of Boeing. They work closely with something called the United Against a Nuclear Iran, which paid her $127,000 as a consultant. And of course, she has the same line as the neocons in Washington: no negotiations on Ukraine or Israel. So the U.S. War Party remains completely committed to those wars. Now, one interesting development is an interview in the Berliner Zeitung on October 20th with former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder. Schroeder reported that he was involved in the March 2022 negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, in which the Ukrainians agreed to a new security agreement, which included no Ukraine in NATO, an end to the confrontation in the Donbass, some other areas still to be worked out, but along the lines of fulfilling the Minsk Accord. He reported that the Ukrainian delegation was open to make those concessions for peace, but they said they had to get support from the U.S., and the U.S. denied them the right to have negotiations. Now, we already knew this. We knew that Zelensky was inclined toward accepting a deal and then was told not to. Boris Johnson was sent by NATO explicitly to tell Ukraine no deal. Now, Schroeder finished his interview saying that Scholz and Macron, the German Chancellor and the French President, could talk to Putin. and he said they should participate in working out a negotiated ceasefire for Ukraine. The question is, why won't they do it? Is it they're really afraid that Russia's going to conquer Europe? Or are they more afraid that the globalist neocons will undercut their governments and launch operations against them? They shouldn't be so concerned. Scholz already has conceded the right of the U.S. to destroy Germany's energy system by the destruction of the North Sea pipelines. So the question is, how can this drive toward war be stopped? And I'll put again the petition that we're circulating now in the description section. Sign it, circulate it, become part of our movement to take power out of the hands of these war hawks and neocons who are trying to preserve a collapsing world order. Thanks for joining me today. I'll see you again tomorrow.